Hello. Um, I've never, I've never liked the idea of evil. It's always come across as a catch-all boogeyman, a way for parents to explain away the horrors of the world without having to deal with problematic things like nuance. I've never liked the idea of evil because it rejects a lot of facts about the world. How people rarely do things they believe to be bad, how actions don't exist in a vacuum, and how people, no matter how flawed, can always change for the better. After October 7th of 2023, I found myself believing in evil.
I'm Viqar Hussain. I'm a professor in the Math and Stats department at UNB, and I have an interest in world affairs more broadly and world history.
My name is Sean Narayan. I'm a professor of international relations at St. Thomas. And in this particular subject, I've written a couple of articles on mostly Canadian foreign policy in regard to the Middle East.
I'm Stuart Donovan, and I'm a professor here at St. Thomas. I teach primarily cultural studies courses now through film, but I started, of course, out in English. For your purposes, I taught Holocaust literature for about 30 years.
The entire construction of the State of Israel is a colonial project designed and delivered from London, England. This began with the Balfour Declaration, and it was an arrangement, and had there been a different British foreign minister and a different British government at the time, it may not have happened at all. In fact, I'm even now surprised to find out how many people have no idea of the history of Israel-Palestine. They have no idea of how Israel was set up. And many of them don't have an idea of the entire colonization of the Americas in any detail.
After 2,000 years being away from a piece of land, why do you have any logical or moral claim to it at all? Like my family is 200 years removed from India. Now, that's only 200 years. That's not 2,000 years. And I would consider the idea that I'm indigenous to India, or that I could go back to India and, presumably throw some family off their land and take it because, I can demonstrate maybe that my family was from this piece of land 200 years ago. That's ridiculous. Zionism was not a popular movement among the Jewish people of Europe. And many of them rejected it for exactly these reasons. They said, look, we're people from Europe, we're Europeans, we have European culture, language, all these things. We don't have any association or affinity with a piece of land in the Middle East. Why should we go there?
It's not very different from how South Africa was taken over by colonists, and the local populations, indigenous populations in South Africa, were relegated to little settlements, and they were part of the underclass. And basically South Africa was occupied by the whites. Palestinian territories have been occupied by Israel.
They're at a different stage of subjugating their indigenous population. They're at a stage that, say, the Americans were at in the late 1800s. Where they were in the process of, and frankly, obviously much earlier than that too, but they sort of wrapped it up in the 1800s, late 1800s, the so-called Indian Wars, where they basically subjugated and destroyed the last remnants of resistance to white European rule across the entire continent.
The United States, since 1972, has vetoed 34 UN Security Council resolutions that are in various ways criticizing Israel for the occupation, for its attacks on Palestinians, for building settlements, you name it.
Israel was definitely founded by Ashkenazi European Jews. It was definitely founded, and for many years it defended itself as saying it is a bastion of Western civilization amidst the sea of savages. When I was growing up and in the 1970s, this was said openly.
There are 30 million Zionists in the United States, but they're Christians. There are only 16 million Jews in the whole world, 16.7, I think, million Jews in the whole world. But there are 30 million Zionists, Christian Zionists. And what they're not interested in the Jews. They're interested in the Jews dying for the rapture, all of these, evangelical, I like to call them conspiracy tropes, but they believe in them deeply. And so it is, at its essence, it's an American making.
Actually, back in the 1980s, when the United States was running, basically destabilizing all of Latin America and running the Contras in Nicaragua and creating violence all over the place. Again, Israel provided a lot of the training and also a lot of the weaponry to these groups, these right-wing groups that were acting.
What have we seen? We've seen in 14 days, we've seen 3,000 children killed. How on earth does that make any sense to anybody in any Western power structure? How? It's just staggering to me. The TRC project started maybe a decade ago. There are documents coming out slowly recognizing what happened to the First Nations, officially recognizing. It's been known for a long time. It's been known for hundreds of years. But the fact that the government is only now acknowledging and writing that truth and reconciliation is something that's necessary, and that these lands were occupied. Look at the land acknowledgements that are recited on every campus of this university. How long will it take for Israel to get to that point?
You don't like to think of all those deaths of those children to be in vain, and that is there some. I don't think there's ever any going back to any kind of normalization, but we were long past that anyway.
I think right now it underlines the fact that if you're a colonized people, the Western world is more than willing to make excuses to support the perpetuation of your colonization.
I think the longer I do this, the harder it is to see it as anything other than some shitty exploitation piece. I got up this morning and on Instagram learned that I think 51% of all the buildings in Gaza have been destroyed, leaving over 1 million people displaced and homeless. And here I am walking around a university campus just interviewing the only people who got back to me, which are political science professors. I don't see any value, I guess, in documenting this in the way I am, and that it's just taking something horrible and turning it into a narrative. But I also don't know what else I can do.
Well, I mean, the hypocrisy is so blatant, and there's also this empathy gap. For example, Ukrainian victims, because they're white and blonde-haired and blue-eyed, are like us. Palestinian victims are not like us. They don't look like us. That's pure racism.
No one interviewed from Israel is being asked if they condemn what Israel is doing in Gaza. No one is being asked if they condemn what Israel's been doing to Gaza for the past 17 years, which is totally illegal, or for that matter, if they condemn Israel's massive expansion of settlements in the West Bank.
The other day I saw, I think it was either The Onion or The Hard Times, but it was one of those, one of those joke satire online magazines, and essentially it was titled "Dying Gazans Still Will Not Condemn Hamas," and it was kind of funny, and I went on, not thinking about it, and a few days later I saw a CBC article mentioning that Gazans are essentially like near death. Their homes have been bombed, they're refugees in their own home, and the article was chastising them. This is from the CBC, chastising them for not condemning Hamas.
What Israel's been doing since 1967 is a slow ethnic cleansing and a slow genocide just flying below the radar. And the Western politicians aren't aware of it or don't care about it. As Noam Chomsky says, the problem with the Palestinians is really that they're very poor and they don't have resources, and they're not a big market for anything. So Western capitalism doesn't care, and therefore Western politicians don't care.
The third world, the developing world, I like to still call it the third world because we've placed them third. And this notion of developing, what does that mean? Do capitalism like us and fuck the planet up even more? Is that what that means? This business that, of capitalism, what they sold us all the time, right, was that, raising up the quality of life, But, the cost, at what cost?
I saw a recent graphic which listed the casualties in the Gaza wars starting in 2006. if you were to give that data to a machine learning algorithm, and given that there are approximately 1,500 casualties on the Israeli side, that data, machine learning algorithm would predict 50,000 dead in Gaza. We have a long way to go if the West just sits and watches.
You know, there's an expression in the Israeli Defense Force, the IDF, when they talk about going into Gaza, they talk about mowing the grass.
I saw a video, and it was of this baby sensory video on YouTube, and it was a bunch of bright colors and stuff, and then there's some text that shows up, essentially saying, "We know your kids can't understand this. The Palestinians have killed 40 babies. They've decapitated them. These people are after your children." You can scroll through on TikTok, and you will be seeing the most dehumanizing, vile, like, just horrific rhetoric calling these people savages and inhuman, and then you'll scroll down a little bit only to see videos of the exact same, of the people they're talking about just living in these bombed out husks of buildings, just tears running down their cheeks. And it's, you get that back to back, and you can't, you can't control a narrative in the way that you could. And I think that's kind of coming back. And I think that might be the beauty of social media, that you can't control the narrative, but also just that it's all there constantly, and you're just being inundated with evil.
For many years now, Israeli Jews have been able to get along without ever seeing a Palestinian, right? The fact that you've got, like all these people on the other side of a wall in the West Bank, that you've got all these people chained up and locked up in Gaza, they can live their lives totally ignoring them, right? And Israel, like economically and technologically, is a first world country. Gaza has like it's one of the most impoverished places on earth. And you look at the state of the Palestinians in the West Bank and the West Bank itself, and they're not much better off. So it was possible to ignore them, like just pretend they don't exist and go about living your life, and then suddenly they literally break out of their prison.
Everything that's going on now has been going on for a long time. The only difference now is the impunity with which Israel is using American weapons, American fighter planes, to kill civilians en masse. It's basically mass murder. If you don't want to call it genocide, fine. It's still mass murder of civilians.
And then we have endless excuses for why these things are, in fact, permissible or the fault of the Palestinians themselves, or why they're complicated, to use a very overused word.
I think it was after the Korean War in North Korea, 60 to 80% of the infrastructure had been completely bombed out of existence, We have the gall, we have the audacity to point to them now and say all these horrible things like, yes, no, I don't like Kim Jong-un very much, I don't like dictators, but it's very obviously the case that the situation in Korea didn't just come about in a vacuum. It came about because of international intervention. This isn't a rare thing. This happens constantly.
I mean, don't forget the Americans bombed 5 million, killed 5 million people during the Vietnamese War. 65,000 Americans died. My first cousin was in it. He's got PTSD from it. But 65,000 versus 5 million. This kind of policy and attitude, it's like a throwback. We're back to the future, right? We're back to the 1960s again, in a good way in terms of people like yourself and young people getting politicized again and radicalized, but also in a bad way because, the empire is kind of at it again, when this, last gasp here, where they're going to commit genocide on the Palestinian people, and they're letting it happen. I mean, they are. It's happening.
Like I said, who's going to take Western arguments about rules-based international order or international law or human rights seriously after this?
Do you think that's a good thing?
Yeah, I do actually. The Western world has ruled over the planet for about 200 to 300 years, at least, depending on where you're counting and when you're counting. in a very capricious and often, not often, always exploitative way. And the Western dominance of the world, I think, has to be broken. And insofar as this helps to break that, that's a good thing.
The only language that colonialism understands, unfortunately, is economic power and military power, and the global south has neither. So I don't see this ending very quickly. The only way I can see it ending is if there's sufficient awareness raised, because we now have instant communication, that the population in the Western countries will elect leaders more responsible than Biden, more responsible than Sunak, and more responsible than Trudeau.
I'm not sure that the ballot is the weapon of choice anymore. You know, I was talking to my friend Mike Clow the other day, and I said, look, 100,000 people jamming London Bridge or whatever, the new version of it. And he said, yeah, I remember that during the Iraq War, but do you remember, he said, did it have any impact? No. But that doesn't mean you stop fighting or you stop being a moral being, you know. You have to have this sense of ethics, sense of a moral conscience, a sense of the fight. That's the whole point of it. And what we do as we go out is we fight for justice for our species, right? Among our species. You know, humans are fascinating creatures, you know, they are. They're fascinating species. and the vast majority of us are good. The vast majority. But when we get caught up in a system like late capitalism, neoliberalism, whatever, the power gets away from us.
I've been working on this for the better part of a month now, I think. And I've kind of run into the same issue that I've had pretty much since I threw together like the very first draft of this, which is just, I don't know how to end it. I started this off wondering if, you know, my whole life, I guess I was wrong about this concept of evil, and saying it out loud sounds very corny, admittedly. But the thing about, like, systems of government is the way they pit the worker against the worker. You know, like whether that be through scarcity or through propaganda or through all these different kind of systems of control. And it's not necessarily the individual IDF soldiers or the individual American soldiers or the individual politicians or news anchors or propagandists, but at some point you kind of just, you know, how do you sleep? How do you have that much blood on your hands and get to just wake up the next day? How is it fine that you can contribute to such horrors and the only punishment you'll ever get for it is just guilt? And that's if you feel bad about it. I don't want to say that that's evil, because I think that the truth of that is that it's just so upsettingly human to lose empathy for those that you are far away from. This is something big, and there's something big happening, and I don't know if I can ever really, even after this is all done, I don't know if I'll be able to wrap my head around it and say something concise, but especially now in the midst of it, this is just, it's not a story, it's just something that needs to be said.